If you've got big dreams and bad genes, you're in the right place. These shirts are available at barbellapparel.com, link in the description. The Austrian oak, born in Austria in 1947, became California governor from 2003 to 2011, star of movies and films, and yes, Mr. Olympia 7 times. As a young man, he was inspired directly by Reg Park's portrayal of Hercules, and Reg would eventually become a direct friend and mentor. Teenage Arnold competed in powerlifting and Olympic lifting between 1963 and 1968, again, preserving the bridge between strength and physique culture. This imprinted on his training, along with Reg's mentorship, as Arnold favored heavy barbell lifts, including ones that are less used today, such as cleans and high pulls. Arnold was a big advocate of squats, but his legs were arguably his weakest link. Is this an argument against squats as a primary builder, or is it that the defined muscular development from broad movement patterns differs significantly from person to person? We can only speculate. Now, that early influence of heavy lifters like Park and his time spent training for strength in competitions would be married with more modern specialized methods, as Joe Weider recruited Arnold and took him to the US at 21 years old in 1968. There, Arnold would train and, like so many of his peers, adopt much of the influence of Weider's principles. Simple ones like progressive overload, sure, but more complex and specialized approaches would pop up in Arnold's training as well. He used many sets reminiscent of Bill Pearl's grueling schedule, but instead of leaving some in the tank, he would include advanced fatigue techniques like supersets, pre-fatigue, rest pause, and of course training specifically for the pump to take his sets to and beyond failure. Arnold also used more advanced programming maneuvers like blending heavy and light weights. He would shock the muscle with variation to prevent stagnation, and he would plan and cycle through different blocks of training throughout the year. Now, this last one is a less often talked about feature of bodybuilding training, but one that has to be present for any long-term competitive career to be successful. See, competitive athletes have different demands throughout the season, and training has to adjust around those different time periods. 10 weeks out from a show, dropping body fat is the primary concern, and muscle growth is going to be limited. Whereas 8 months out, immense gains can be made by staying in a caloric surplus and letting body fat climb a little bit. This is generally what we know as bulking and cutting cycles. Cycling the volume and intensity and structure of your training allows you to meet the demands of each phase, while also preventing burnout or stagnation from just staying in the same exact mind-numbingly brutal training split day in, day out. Simply put, if you do the optimal thing for growth year-round, it is no longer optimal. Now, we can see in the program that Arnold laid out that his entire plan was broken into 4 parts, along with each change he made and why. He would drop work immediately after the Olympia to recover, would start to pick it up with a gentle amount of volume, and then would taper up the amount of work into the last 12-week blitz that was his Olympia prep. This breaking of training into dedicated periods is referred to directly as periodization and reflects exactly what the Soviets were working on in the 1950s with their Olympic sports team. The attempt to give a predictably effective structure to all of sports led to innovations in training that are still used today across the board, including powerlifting and Olympic lifting. And bodybuilding, though they don't talk about it as much, still benefits from such an approach. Now, bodybuilding doesn't involve the number of variables that, say, football or baseball does, where strength, power, conditioning, coordination, and game strategy all have to be developed and peaked for one singular game. But periodization does address the fact that in strength sports and bodybuilding, the same exercises, reps, and structure leads to diminished returns. So what is most effective is not just a byproduct of genetics or drug use, or how supremely effective the protocol is in a vacuum by itself, but it's also based on the most recent thing that you actually adapted to. The same stress doesn't do the same thing across your entire training life. Now, this is the primary reason the shock principle exists to begin with, as a way to introduce something new that you aren't acclimated to, and it's the reason that different training phases can be so useful. You have to train the same thing long enough to show progress, which might be 4 weeks, it might be 4 months, but too long on the same thing and your progress comes to a screeching halt. This perspective can also give some clarity, as many bodybuilders make the mistake of thinking about training as what happens today in the gym, and any discussion of what methods are effective don't go beyond that into the week or the month. So when Mike Mentzer, a sharp critic of Arnold's high training volume, asked if 5 sets are better, then why not 100? He was treating volume like bodybuilders treat all training variables, as something that is meant to be set in stone at some optimal level and left alone, not something that is meant to be turned up and down over the course of a training year to get a desired result. Very extreme workout protocols can yield great results, but aren't sustainable long term, which is exactly why Arnold only did a 6-day per week double split for the prep leading into the Mr. Olympia. The amount of work was changed throughout the year based on what was needed to grow and how long it could be sustained for, and that cuts to the core of programming for all of sports, and it makes up most of the training decisions that are going to be present in any sufficiently good training program. This brings us to the controversy of high intensity versus high volume training, which pits those who believe anything more than one set to failure is a waste of time against, well, everybody else. Guys, if I can help fund this channel and help you solve a problem, I call that a win-win. So please allow me one moment to preach the good word of Boostcamp. I tend to get a little complex when I'm writing workout plans. Tracking progress for these programs is hugely important, but options were never great. I would write these long, complex progressions by hand into a notebook, or I would carry a binder filled with spreadsheets I printed off of LiftVault. That's why I'm here to introduce you to Boostcamp. Boostcamp is the easy way to track training progress directly from your phone. Their library of programs features countless dozens of powerlifting and hypertrophy specific programs from your favorite creators, including Jeffrey Verity Schofield, Johnny Candido, Eric Helms, Greg Nuckols, Alberto Nunez, and of course, yours truly. Boostcamp also has exclusive programs that you just won't find anywhere else. Select the one best suited to your needs and watch the sets, reps, weights, and exercises populate automatically. Don't guess at that one weight you lifted that one time for how many reps again? Have your log of training with you at all times for easy reference in the convenience of your phone. Not only does Boostcamp have a stellar product, but their support is the only reason this channel exists. So thank you, the viewer, and thank you to Boostcamp. Check it out today. The link is in the description. Arthur Jones, inventor of Nautilus machines and all-around eccentric, is known for coining high-intensity training as a term in training protocol and using it to market his new line of Nautilus equipment.
There was one man in the right place and at the right time. He created an exercise formula and turned it into a $300 million empire. Arthur Jones.
He sold it as an alternative to the 2-hour marathons so common in bodybuilding, not only suggesting that one set performed to failure was adequate for growth, but that it was actually superior. In a separate video, I chronicle the details of Arthur's infamous Colorado experiment, where he spiked what was supposed to be an academic study so he could claim that his methods caused Casey Viator to gain 63 pounds of muscle in 28 days. And yes, there are still some people that repeat that number to this day. This reminds me of Sandow and Charles Atlas with their cheap mail order systems. No one is buying the workout that requires skill with clunky metal equipment and hours of work a day, but if you tell them they can get it in one set in a gym filled with idiot-proof equipment, the sky's the limit. Arthur was nothing if not a brilliant marketer. It worked, and it worked well, and it was another step in him becoming one of the wealthiest men in his day. Now, Mike Mentzer was a talented young bodybuilder who was influenced by Casey Viator, and he ended up working for Jones himself. Mike switched to those methods on his short competitive run in the late 70s and wrote about his own take on high intensity in his books Heavy Duty 1 and 2, published in 1993 and 1996 respectively. This method has been adopted by a handful of bodybuilders over the years, most notably Dorian Yates when he became one of the first true mass monsters of the modern era, and then more recently Jordan Peters, who looks like Dorian Yates ate Dorian Yates. The main idea of high intensity is that a sufficient amount of effort on a single set done to failure can trigger a growth response, and that by stopping the workout and focusing on recovery, growth is then maximized. HIIT advocates say that the extra volume doesn't correlate with growth, but actually creates more breakdown and makes recovery take longer. Limited growth from overtraining is absolutely a thing. You can push it too hard where your body doesn't grow in response, but this really is a hard nut to crack. These athletes had developed massive amounts of muscle over many years and developed a resistance to growth as a result. The simple fact of having that excessive muscle tissue is the body's attempt at rendering training stress, namely weight and volume, completely inert. What bodybuilders back in the day likely experienced was a slowing of gains as they trained throughout their career, and in an effort to stay competitive in an ever-expanding sport, realized that clocking more time and effort resulted in noticeable growth. The state of golden era bodybuilding training can be defined as much work as possible, with many repeating sets over many exercises, often leading to north of 30 or 40 total sets per workout, and this led to many of the best physiques in the history of the sport. Here's a short run of Arnold's contemporaries in the Golden Era who used generally high amounts of work. You have Franco Columbu, Arnold's often training partner and lifelong friend. The Italian bodybuilder's methods were cut from the same cloth as Arnold. His advanced chest routine featured 7 sets of bench, pyramiding up to heavy reps, followed by 4 sets each of 4 other exercises in the 8 to 10 rep range. The emphasis on weight is no doubt a factor that led to Franco's physique, but also the strength that made him an early World's Strongest Man competitor along with Lou Ferrigno. Now Ferrigno, otherwise known as the Incredible Hulk, stood 6'5" and 315 pounds, or about 135 kilos in the off-season. He was portrayed as Arnold's rival in pumping iron, which is funny considering that Lou cites Steve Reeves' version of Hercules as his primary inspiration in opposition to Arnold's motivation by Reg Park's version. And I guess films were short on strong representation because Ferrigno would take on the role himself in a 1983 reimagining. Lou preferred to train each muscle group once per week. To maximize work in one session, he would do upwards of 10 exercises depending on the day, each for 4 to 5 sets of 8 to 10 reps. Sergio Oliva, born in 1941, was another transfer from Olympic lifting, having competed in the 1962 Games at 198 pounds or 90 kilos for Cuba. He gained political asylum in the US and became one of the greats of his era, winning the Olympia in 1967 and 68. His training was similarly high volume. 2 of the workouts that he used followed this scheme, pyramiding up over 10 sets of bench while supersetting chin variations. 10 sets of behind the neck superset with dips, and 5 sets of supersets for shoulders, arms, and rows, every single set 10 to 15 reps. There were 2 separate arm days with similar work, and funnily enough, only 6 sets of squats for all of the leg work in his week. It looks like the former Olympic lifter had had his fill of squats, but you can draw an easy correlation between the amount of upper body work specifically for the arms and Sergio's impressive and groundbreaking physique. And then lastly, you have Frank Zayn, who is known for his narrower physique that prioritized aesthetics over mass. Zayn preferred a push-pull leg split, ran with 1 day off, meaning he would repeat each workout every 4 days. 3 sets of 12, 10, 8 with short rest was the norm, focusing on stretching and the pump. While less substantial than the marathon workouts of his contemporaries, it would still amount to quite a bit of volume over his claimed 75-minute workout times. And oh yeah, I forgot, you can't talk about a lot of training work in the Golden Era without mentioning Tom Platz, who is a legend not just for the biggest quads anybody has ever seen ever, but for his absolutely brutal approach to training. He was born in 1955, started competing in the early 70s, right at the midpoint of the Golden Era, and has earned legendary status for his just insane, unhinged training protocols. The workouts retained the big movements and high volume that everybody else was doing, but turned the effort up to 10 and then kept turning it. He engaged in these murderous workouts with 5 to 10 sets of high rep protocols over multiple exercises per muscle group. Now this is difficult for upper body, but for the legs, if you do it to the limit, it's torturous, and Tom did it to the limit, and his willingness to suffer led to the biggest legs in the game. Now if you take all of this information over all of these Golden Era figures, all of it can be taken to several different conclusions. You can interpret it as volume being generally better, since all studies show a dose-dependent relationship where more work tends to trend with more gains to a point, or you can interpret it as superior genetics along with steroids that allows otherwise crippling amounts of work to be done, where only the best can get away with this, and even then it's maybe not ideal. You could also acknowledge the lifetime of training of the average bodybuilder, where acquiring superhuman amounts of muscle required ever more work and effort to convince the body to hold just a few more pounds of lean tissue. You can consider how this effect varies over time. You can consider the individual genetic variation that might make one method preferable to one person over another. Any one of these conclusions seems rational, but again, we can only speculate. Now, the high-intensity crowd argues that it was only because of steroids that they could recover from the incredible workload to begin with, and that natural lifters are better suited with high intensity. But there's a problem with this. HIIT's biggest names, Yates, Mentzer, Viator, Peters, were all aggressive steroid users, and the same property that would make a steroid user survive brutally high volume would also allow that person to get away with less work and still grow. It both lowers the minimum effective volume you need to grow and raises your maximum recoverable volume. So basically, more things work. Add in the obvious genetic gifts and it makes the picture even more fuzzy. Here's Arnold at 16 years old, genetically predispositioned to be a great bodybuilder. It's obvious in his earliest pictures. But here's Yates after only 9 months of training. And here's Mentzer at 18 years old in his very first bodybuilding show. Both Yates and Mentzer were using traditional volume methods at the time these pictures were taken, and both of them were further along the curve than some people with 10 years under their belt. With very little time spent training, it was obvious that these two would go far with any amount of time and discipline. And again, whether you want to argue that they got good because of their methods or in spite of it, because of the genes, because of the steroids, or in spite of it, all seems to be a matter of bias. Now, of special interest is Mike Mentzer, whose entire bodybuilding competitive career was incredibly short. His first show was in 1970 at 18 years old, and at 195 pounds, he showed the promise of a great bodybuilder. In 1971, just a year or two later, he injured his shoulder and stopped training until 1975. He then picked training back up and had a quick run of success until his last show at the Mr. Olympia in 1980. Now, I know Mike Mentzer at his last show in 1980 looked like a 45-year-old 70s adult film star, but he was actually only 28 years old in this appearance. The story goes that Arnold came back from time away and took the win in a very controversial decision. Mentzer ended up placing 5th. Mentzer, who was so dejected, not only threw his trophy in the trash, but gave up bodybuilding as well as lifting altogether and proceeded to atrophy and get overweight. Now, understanding the difficulty of a hard loss, it's hard for me to sympathize with Mentzer at all. He dropped out of med school in a bid to become a psychiatrist after 3 years. Within his first year of competing in bodybuilding, he stopped training for 4 years. And within his comeback and subsequent 5-year meteoric run to the top, where he became a supposed heir to the Olympia throne, one hard loss caused him to not just give up competing, but lifting altogether. His books Heavy Duty 1 and 2 were published in the mid-90s, in 1993 and 96, when Mike was in the throes of heavy amphetamine use and depending on young bodybuilders to live with him and pay his rent. Meanwhile, his primary rival Arnold had secured his legacy as one of the best ever and was coming off a decade of action blockbusters, including 1991's Terminator 2, which is one of James Cameron's masterpieces and Arnold's most iconic role. Now, this isn't just to put Mentzer's name in the mud. He was intelligent, a promising writer, and slated to be one of the next great competitors. But his personality was that of a self-saboteur, and it makes him somewhat of a cautionary tale. He's a person whose unwillingness to commit and finish what he started cost him what he could have been. His inconsistent track record is a stark juxtaposition to the story of Arnold, whose own obvious flaws exist right next to his legacy, which is that of a man who set impossibly high goals and stopped at nothing to get them. Mike had a combined 6 years of active competition, only 5 of which were as an established adult, and his legacy were 2 books overstuffed with philosophy and personal thoughts that claimed to know the one true method of training, one set to failure as a fixed rule, which was in specific opposition to Arnold, along with every other bodybuilder of the era. Even his books fell short of Arnold's, with the first Heavy Duty clocking in at an embarrassing 67 pages compared to Arnold's exhaustive Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding at over 700 pages. I understand that Heavy Duty was written entirely by Mike, but still, it is the commitment to doing something great and forming a team and delegating responsibility that led to one of the most seminal pieces of bodybuilding of all time that most newbies still benefit from using today. That did not come from the guy that was known for giving up before he finished what he set out to do. Now, you cannot, of course, relate personality traits or book lengths to training efficacy, but given the tortured history of Mike Mentzer, there is a poetic irony to his claim that the problem with modern bodybuilding was simply people doing too much work. With statements about this thing being better than that thing, there are few firm statements that we can make, and opinions are really far from conclusive, but where I'm convinced of HIIT's lack of superiority, not to say it's not effective in the first place, is simply the fact that it prohibits the use of volume at any given time. It's a foolish and one-dimensional way to treat training variables, which are meant to be changed by need. Volume is a dial that can be turned up or down at any given time to manipulate stress and manage recovery. It's another tool to get a desired result, and you can't use it in an exclusively low-volume system. Single methods don't retain their perfect growth-stimulating capabilities because your very adaptation to them makes them less effective. Your perfect approach depends heavily on the last thing you adapted to, and any stalled-out HIIT follower will begin to grow quickly simply by adding in a few extra sets, even if only for a temporary period of time.